good enough, I think. Cool. Floor's yours.
Okay, so I had about serious games in science education. I'm just going to start with some basic history of, first of all, serious games. Serious games is not exactly a new phenomenon, even though the term serious games came around 2002. The first games developed for PC was serious games made for research in, for example, suicides. And the first home game console also was shipped with a bunch of serious games for education. One of the games it was shipped with is this right here. The game is called Analogic, and it's a math game basically to teach basic summarization. The gameplay is quite simple. It's a two-player versus game. You either start on the even or on odd planet. On every move you have to land on a number with your same even or odd polarity. The twist, though, is that you use the number from your opponent's last move to add to the number you're moving to, and it has to end up with your polarity. So, for example, if odd starts by moving up to 3, then even has to move to a number which added with 3 equals even number. So, for example, 5. 5 plus 3 is 8. Right? Basic mathematics. There's some extra rules on the game, but that's the main point. And the game is, of course, aimed at teaching children mathematics. So serious games up to 2002 was mostly aimed at education. 65.8% of all games, well, I say all games, but all games that is a part of this diagram. The list of all these serious games is from the site serious.gameclassification.com. If you want to check that one out. But up to 2002, they have 953 games in the database. And 2002 is considered the starting point of the current wave of serious games. It was kind of kickstarted by a paper that came out in 2002. Don't remember the name. It's in the source, one of the sources here. The current wave is almost more spread out than the last, the previous waves. So you can see that education just fell from 60% to 28% of all serious games made. And actually advertising is the new main game. So one of the games that came out in around 2002 is a game called Quest Atlantis. It's an MMO role-playing game aimed at children around 10 years old. It was kind of answer to the whole gun violence in games crisis. So they tried to make a game that's basically peaceful and aimed at cooperation instead of competition. So they also wanted to teach kids about all the real world issues you can face. So they created a fantasy world where basically evil scientists had almost destroyed the world in a quest for science. And your goal was to kind of rebuild everything by researching, for example, science, education, or medicine, all those aspects of real world. And all this, the whole game kind of centered around the storyline of that sort. But This was a proper like student-teacher game, so you had classrooms and such in the game where teachers could teach, and the students were there in the virtual world and listening. But as well as the classroom aspects, students actually like play the game on their free time voluntarily because it was actually quite fun, which kind of successfully engaged them in a way serious games doesn't usually do. So it's a really successful example of science education game, adults. So of course there's some problems I found while trying to research this. First of all, research into like science, serious games for science education is kind of wacky. The studies that are around are kind of short mostly, like not short in writing, but short time frames. So it's hard to judge the proper effect of a serious game. Of course, the learning outcome is kind of hard to measure because you have to like isolate what does a game do and what does everything else do and such kind of difficult problems. And mostly all research papers kind of have a low sample size for the research. So the outcomes aren't really crystal clear. They also have quite a lot of conflicting results. So you will have papers that say science education games helps, you have papers that say they don't really have an effect, and then you have papers that say they have the opposite effect. And that kind of shows that there's a disconnect between what the games that are made and the learning goal they want to accomplish. They're not like uniting them properly. And one of the problems that, one of the reasons that is because many like research papers treat games as a separate activity. So you can replace, for example, a lecture with play a game, which doesn't really have the proper effect because games are a tool, not like an encompassing thing for all learning. You have to use games properly. A part of that is something called Bloom's Taxonomy. It's a hierarchical framework for learning. Basically, you start at the bottom when you want to learn something. You start with basically remembering what it is. And every level above requires that you understand everything underneath it. So once you have remembered what it is about, you can start understanding it. Once you understand it, you can apply it. Once you apply it, you can analyze it, and so on. The problem I've found with science education games are that they kind of stuck at level 1, remembering. They just try to make you remember things, but they don't really make you understand them. So the effect they kind of want to seek out aren't really showcased in the game itself. There's a disconnect there, which they struggle with. And the paper itself kind of wants to remedy this. So for those who have trouble remembering the paper, it was about using serious games to learn science concepts, of course. But they wanted to use the gameplay as an analogy for the science concept they wanted to learn. And thus, the focus was not on the design and usage of the game itself. It's about how you map the analogy of the game to the science concept you want to learn, which is something not a lot of papers do right now. Which is why I chose it, because it was kind of interesting. So the science concept the papers kind of want to learn is photosynthesis, heat transfer, and electricity. So I'm just going to say now one of the problems I have with the paper is that electricity was the only concept, like the only game they actually explained properly. They described the whole like gameplay aspects of it all. Photosynthesis and heat transfer is described in one line, which doesn't really tell us much about it. But photosynthesis was about having a robot create glucose while exploring a cave to get energy to move on. Heat transfer was about you being on some kind of intergalactic zookeeper, which needed to heat the eggs to keep them at the right temperature to hatch. And then you actually have a properly explained game, electricity. And in this game you have a lot of monsters that wants to create musicals, basically. And to create musicals, they of course hold each other's hand in the right way. You can see that every monster has one closed fist and one open fist, and you have to attach a closed fist and an open fist, just like electricity, positive and negative polarity. Once everybody is connected in a circuit, the like random pitch of the music tunes out and becomes a proper song, which kind of showcases how the conductor circuit actually conducts electricity for the students. And of course the research question, because it's good to have in mind when you discuss game. That's if the students play digital games and engage in discussion about mapping analogies, actually understand more than those who just play the games but don't really engage in their discussions. And to answer that, we first of all explain the methodology. So the approach is kind of similar. You have the treatment group and the comparison group. Treatment, of course, is the ones who have the mapping methodology, and the comparison is they play games and then discuss the game by themselves. Everybody does the 5 minutes of gameplay, but the difference is after gameplay. In the treatment group, teachers actually have proper PowerPoints and such to explain electricity and the analogy with the monsters. But in the comparison group, they were kind of put into like small groups of students and told to just discuss what they played, and that doesn't really help much because students need guidance. And then you still have the teacher-led presentations. And the topic for like the proper scientific concepts explained. And then after they explain the proper scientific concepts, they play the game again. And the treatment group again has like 15 PowerPoints explaining, showcasing the electricity game, for example, and then showcasing the electrical circuit right next to it, so that students can properly visualize like the similarities between the two groups, two concepts. But the comparison group was again just put into the small groups of students and asked to question if their like understanding of the game has changed since the last time. So the result here was kind of interesting because they first of all showcased positive impact for electricity, the game about electricity, but they had no measurable impact for photosynthesis and heat transfer. like the concept if showcasing the analogies or not actually helped it. So it's kind of hard to judge these results because again, they did not actually explain properly how the photosynthesis games and heat transfer games works. They properly explain the electricity. They showcase the game mechanics, how it's supposed to work and stuff. So you can see that, you can kind of judge if the game makes sense in this context. But they never actually showcased any game mechanics for the two other games. So we can't really judge if they have no impact because the games kind of sucked, or if they're just the concept of analogy itself just isn't really that great. So that's a big problem I had with these papers. Of course, there's some other criticisms. Well, same. Again, only electricity games is probably explained. But you also had certain things such as low sample size. There was 260 students-ish, which doesn't really reflect, allow you to do proper scientific research. And one interesting problem is that the teachers kind of volunteered to do these games. So the groups are self-selected, basically. Everybody who was part of this study volunteered to be part, chose themselves to be part of the study, which kind of biases it towards people motivated for actually learning, for example, and kind of proving that this works. It would be better if the samples were basically random. And of course, it's always kind of difficult to judge what part of the game worked and what didn't, because serious games is complicated. There's, especially when you're trying to educate people, maybe people went home and did their own research for whatever reason, maybe that influenced the results. You of course have the difference between teachers. If the 6 teachers that was a part of the comparison group did a worse job than the 5 teachers that were part of the concept group, that will influence the results, especially with such a low sample size.
That's it?
Yeah.
That's okay.
And the short.
Yeah, so, but well, it released a lot of discussion, so that's good. All right, there's the first discussion coming in. So yeah, you, Marcus, can start later on. William sent me some questions as well before I will inject at some stage. But let's do the paper first, I think, because we're right on it. Later I will go back to your main story because there's some aspects I want to ask or get out of it as well. Yes. But Marcus, you first.
They say that students who scored higher in the pre-test also did well in the post-test. Mm-hmm. Do you think that the concept of analogy mapping is just too complex to grasp for students who are already struggling? It's more of a helping scaffolding for students who are already doing well?
Well, the paper itself, or the results, kind of imply it. But again, the sample size is too low to be sure, so this is something that needs to be tested more. But, I mean, of see that if you score better, like in normal tests, you will understand easier something, because analogy is kind of a complex concept of learning. So if you are a better student, you will get it easier than if you're struggling. But that's my opinion, and it doesn't really say much. So yeah, you need to research this, which is something I believe they said they needed.
They made some reference. I mean, following up on this point is, I think in the conclusion they have some interesting insights, because they actually admitted and that there needs to be a bit more focus on the notion of knowledge, how distant, or they call it distal knowledges are, right? So how close are they to a concept of interest, or how far they're actually away, right? How aligned they are, right? So so that's probably one of the aspects.
Yeah, and they also say that it might be the reason why they see a difference between the 6th graders and the 7th graders, because the 7th graders already are more exposed to previous knowledge. So
that's right. So the learner level. So yes, yeah. Any other comments regarding this, or else like?
While we're on that, they also kind of talked about that when it comes to the difference between the 3 games, because they saw results on the electricity games, but they struggle to see the results on the 2. They think it might be because the other 2 are more closely related. The analogies are as far distance as the electricity, which may help her to learning approach.
Yeah, they have kind of like a weird statement where they say that good analogies, or in their opinion, are analogies which are farther away from the actual concept. So like the thing about monsters holding hands might be more abstract and therefore more suiting for an analogy than the heating of the eggs in the galactical zoo thingy. Which is kind of strange, because I don't think the electricity game is so far-fetched of an analogy to electricity. But
yeah, for some reason they discuss whether the analogies in the games are different, but they only say once for half a line that maybe the games were just bad. Maybe the hitting and the toxicity these games were just bad.
Yeah.
We have no idea. They did not discuss that at all.
My personal comment would be not exactly a question, but a comment that it's probably that the games weren't as engaging. When I look at the electricity game, the only game that we are provided an image of, I wouldn't present it to 6th and 7th graders. I would consider max 2nd graders to show this game to. Higher grades should have more engaging activities, probably.
Point. So they didn't measure immersions. That's a good point, right? So how far people are actually engaging with this, because they're just still, pre-assessment, post-assessment, but they didn't do any, assessment during the process, right? So
yeah, because when you want to use games to teach kids, then you should engage.
Yeah. It's a very
If
good
the
point.
game is kind of shit, then the kids won't be engaged.
Exactly, right? Or it doesn't relate yet, exactly. So,
I kind of think they let the results kind of bias the paper when they found out that the two games didn't actually do much. They kind of pushed them away and focused on the electricity game, which is kind of hurtful to the paper itself, I would say, because it makes it's harder for everybody else who's reading to actually understand what worked and didn't work.
yeah. That's a good point.
But I don't have anything against the paper because they're such transparent about their limitations. So they kind of state that yes, our sample size is biased and it's non-randomized, and they say that perhaps their games were bad, and they say that they can't say anything about a relation here. So even though they only focus on the electricity game because that obviously worked, they're also pretty transparent about their limitations and results in their conclusion and discussion.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that.
So the paper could be used as a starting point for a next research, trying to solve the problems that the paper had.
That's how we write papers, right? That's the research. Yeah. We leave ourselves gaps so we can scaffold, right? So, just since we're still discussing the distance of analogy, let's let the constructs, we come back to that in a second. But in terms of distance of the analogies, I was thinking, so I had been teaching electricity or principles of electricity in other courses for electronics, right? So especially to younger people engaging with Arduinos and Raspberry Pis and sensory approaches. And what we generally, how we approached it was to use the metaphor of water flow in a river. And while this analogy I find is incredibly close to electricity because it really maps one-to-one, right? You have the river, which is the current, whatever, right? So then you have the impediments in flow, which is the gradient of the river, for example, and then you have resistance, which would correspond to boulders in the water, whatever, right? So, and this is I think a very close analogy, right? The monsters, I find them incredibly detached. I mean, when I read it, the abstraction didn't, I mean, you can even draw some link of how a musical piece should be looking like by having a fully fledged refrain and, I don't know. So basically, you can draw other analogies as well. I find it so loosely related, whereas I could imagine easily other analogies that are much closer to the subject of study. So I find this claim that the analogies should be quite distant a bit, I'm not convinced, basically. So.
The reason why I think they're somewhat related is that they underline the concept of negative and positive pole. So like they don't include ampere or ohms or voltage. So like those concepts aren't included in the analogy mapping at all.
Right.
So with only thinking about a negative and positive pole, I think it's close. But
right.
I think the analogy of a river is more closely to the whole concept of electricity.
Right. Okay. It's probably spot on, but then I'm siding with Mashier, who suggested that you probably shouldn't teach that at 7th grade anymore, because that is 3rd or 4th grade kind of material at best.
Yeah.
So I mean, come on. I mean, positive negativity, we've got to figure that out. But the bigger picture, then it becomes science, or more physics. Anyway. So the point is they leave a lot of space for discussion there, right? So that it's not really clear. They have some analogies. They didn't measure distance, they didn't measure immersion. So those are two factors that are definitely out. But anyway, I don't want to push it further. I just want to highlight that I'm not 100% convinced in some of the claims because they're not substantiated, they're just suggestions that they're potentially made based on their analysis or based on other literature. But sometimes it's also worthwhile just questioning it and asking, okay, would this be a nice research question for the lead-on paper, as opposed to saying, other people say this, therefore, whatever, right? So, yeah.
Building on that, another thing they say is that they use multiple choice tests, and this is a quote, because they test student thinking process the best. And these aren't their claim, they have a source cited, but I don't think if they have students playing these games for half an hour and then doing a multiple choice test about the concept, I don't think that's the best way to measure student thinking process. So other students might grasp the concept and could better explain it in the term of the analogy and pulling in the game, but they kind of limit themselves to a multiple choice test.
It may be it's a region based, because I think in America they do a lot of multiple choice instead of asking and analyzing the questions.
Yeah. So I think I agree totally with you. It doesn't really reflect different learning styles and assessment styles at all. But it's standardized, right? Because it's literally like this. North America is absolutely standard in secondary school to assess by multiple choice, right? Yeah. As little writing as possible. And so if you change the means of assessment, it would be a confounding factor in your experiment, right? Yeah. So you need to use the same means of assessment as you use in a control group in the actual test group, right?
And as I said, they kind of cite the source on it, so they're in the clear with it. But by using such a creative way of learning away stuff, by using the analogy mapping and taking in game concept, inflicting it, and having to explain that on a multiple choice test. I mean, it's the standard, but it's pretty leading in terms of the questions.
Yeah. So that's certainly a risk. I mean, apart from the leading bit, one aspect could also be you're investing so much effort into constructing a rich understanding, yet you use such a simplistic way of assessing it, right? So why the fuss? You know, why all that fuss in the middle when you're just breaking it down to something very simplistic and don't give people to chance, you know, for example, to assess it orally, right? Well, even though it may be unrealistic, but you could still use all 260 students, certain effort, but feasible, and explain the electricity, right? And then you filter out the essential bits and see what they actually got out of it, right? Also, it would make for much more qualitative insights. The problem with multiple choice, from my point of view, is you lose so much, right? Because you basically quantify everything, but additional insights that, hey, you may not even see as a teacher, but the student perhaps sees, will not come out if you don't have a comments section, if you like, right? So that's a bit of a pity, especially if this research is so exploratory, right? They're exploring a new area and see how how it works, right? So it's a very good point. Just coming back, I'm injecting William's question right now because he was actually the first asking it, technically. So he's wondering that the electricity concept actually may have worked better because it actually taught the electricity concept, whereas the other analogies simply asked the player to use the concept that was being taught. So basically, it comes back to the game, the fit of the game to the concept and the immersion aspect, but also that it's actually doing something as opposed to you just using something, kind of thing. And he thinks that may have been well. Yeah, exactly.
That kind of goes back to this primarily.
That's right, loops technology. So that there may be some aspects there. Cool. Any other things that you discovered in the paper, or want to say about the paper, or think about the paper?
Yeah. Well, about the biased and non-random grouping, I have no idea why they decided to make groups like the comparison and treatment that are so unbalanced, even though they might can themselves. Like, they have 73% of 6th graders in one group and 55 in the other. I really didn't get it, because if it was random, then, well, they had a point. But here...
I think it's about how the candidates are self-selected again. So they got volunteering teachers, and they have a set class that they're supposed to teach. So it was kind of, they didn't select the students, they selected the teachers. Yeah. So the students were kind of attached. Yeah.
I side with both of you, of course, because of the selection process and the voluntary nature of the entire experiment. Of course, there's this bias, but I agree with you, because at any conclusion you draw on that is super dangerous, I think, right? Because there's such a disparity. I had the same observation. I felt like, oh yeah, that is critical. So at this stage, you probably can't report more than suggesting, oh, it makes a difference, as opposed to suggesting, well, it makes a small or big difference, right? You can just say something.
Building on that, they, as we talked about earlier, they stated that the 7th grader appeared more receptive of the analogy, but at the same time they had 20% more 7th graders in the treatment condition. So it's a bold claim to do when you have such inconsistencies in your sample size or sample demographic.
Yeah. So just looking at the evaluation a bit, there was a bit of an interaction. Did you spot any certain? Did you get any insights from the statistical evaluation, or any conclusions you could possibly draw from that, with respect to prior knowledge and the use of analogies as a teaching concept? Well, if you look in section 3.2, page 8, there's this comment about pretest scores and the learning by analogy. And it says, well, you mentioned implicitly, the higher pretest scores are, the more you learn about the analogy. From a conclusion point of view, what does it tell you about the learning outcome for the entire class if you really do that in a class setting? will it be necessary an overall beneficial outcome for the class? Assuming you are a teacher, right? You're teaching 7th graders right now, you want to get the concepts across, right? And you also need to expect to see the same kind of crowd in this 8th year again, whatever, right? It's for teaching again. So what effect could you possibly expect based on the insights they got?
Kind of like expanding the difference between the students.
Exactly. It may actually lead to a stratification of performance. You're actually doing worse in terms of getting your class to coherently understand the same concept and move as a cohort from 7th to 8th year. As a lecturer, we're always concerned about this, right? The good students will be good no matter what. Usually, I mentioned that before, we don't teach the good students much in university because they usually, we just point them to a direction and then they're off anyway, right? So never to be seen again. But it's the main catchment. Welcome, any student, welcome. Anyway, it's the main catchment that we're interested in, right? Can we actually ensure that, you know, a 3rd year BProc student has that kind of knowledge, right? And is ready for the workforce, let alone bachelor thesis. But if you have a long tail of students that, yeah, perhaps got the concept or not really got the concept, that's the worst possible outcome you have. So I would make the claim here. So yeah, but please, yeah.
No, just make your claim.
No, please, you. But what do you think?
I mean, they didn't see that the lower scoring students in the analogy or the comparison condition did worse. So like the low scoring students did pretty much the same in both the conditions, but the good students did better in the analogy than in the comparison. And I don't know, I'm not fully on the thing that that every student in a class should be the same, because as you said, you have naturally good students who will be better than the rest, and kind of giving them something to boggle their mind on as well could be good. It's like you're highlighting the good students, but you're not pulling down the bad students. I don't know.
But you're expanding the spread implicitly.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So to the top, okay, admittedly, but it just may make it harder in the next year to teach the same guys, right? Because they're sitting in the same classroom, and the expectations of the better students are probably even higher, let alone their knowledge. And then it would be a lot harder to actually, you know, sustain their interest. We see that as well. For example, we have considerable drop-off in attendance rate. 1st year is quite, everyone shows up, right? 2nd year, yeah, most people showed up. 3rd year, it really becomes like a pyramid, because students, first of all, they challenge their autonomy, but they probably also don't need the input anymore because they have a lot of transfer knowledge from other courses already. And that's fine. And I'm not saying right or wrong, it's just something, that's an interesting implication that is, I find a bit hidden in the paper, but that could be significant in a classroom that is at middle school level, where you expect that to graduate with a high school and admission to university, you know, qualification basically. And at this level, you want to have a certain cohesion of knowledge, right? So, because afterwards you drift off in specialization, you know, doing chemistry, physics, computer science, whatever. But at that stage, you kind of assume a kind of uniform level of baseline education, right? So that's the only comment there. So that was quite interesting. But any other observations of similar nature you guys made? Please.
So they did a bunch of statistics on the students and teachers beforehand, but the thing I find, or I think they should have included, was some statistics on the gamers in the group. So kind of like how many hours does the average student spend on games, to actually see if students who games much takes the analogy easier or understands the game easier due to that fact. So I think that's kind of missing in the study, because they only have like female, male, and the age gap and some pre-tests, but not so much about the games.
Yeah, but it is something they're kind of missing, but at the same time it can also be seen as another area of study, not necessarily something they should take it with, because you can't study everything, you have to scope it down. So it can be seen as something that wasn't that as necessary as the rest of the data to study. You have several studies that kind of goes into, are gamers better at understanding serious games than the rest of the people?
True, yeah, that was one of the earlier papers we talked about. Well, anyway, it's worthwhile. It would be worthwhile demographic information as opposed to, for example, level of urbanization or urban students. That's really interesting.
I think that's much more irrelevant if you live in a small town or a big town than if they had included like how much time spent on gaming, because that's much more relevant or interesting for me at least to see if people who games much takes the analogies in games or the comparison even easier than non-gamers, because it's I would argue that it's kind of a way of thinking about things. When you are gaming, you're more kind of used to it and see the game objective easier than people who have never touched a game. So
it can also be that it's just hard to find kids that's not gamers these days. So it may be just data they had 100% game, which is not that uncommon anymore.
That's a risk, yeah. So, any comments about the negative correlation of urban students' environments and the performance in the electricity? Any thoughts on that? Did anyone see that on page 9 in table 4? So for model 1, so you have this table there, right? And it applies all the 4 games, model 1, 2, 3, 4, 4, and so on. And then you have the treatment group, the effect size, the pure effect size, the main effect, and then also you have the interaction to some extent with the correlation with the level to which schools are in urban areas. So what's your comments on that one? I mean, it reports minus 0.74. Admittedly, I felt they haven't discussed that really enough. But what does it tell you? What would it tell you at face value? Or what could it tell you anyway? It's a correlation again. Well, if it's negatively correlated, the success, right, so of the treatment and the better understanding is negatively correlated to urbanization, it basically just says, well, you know, if you live in a small city, you probably or may do better with analogies. Is that a sensible conclusion? People living in smaller places are better at understanding analogies? Yes. Yes. Well, of course not, right? So, but that is but I felt that could have been explored a bit better, right? But it probably, if you see interaction, for example, with the 6th grader assessment, which is negatively correlated or strongly negatively correlated, it basically clearly says the prior knowledge is super decisive in terms of understanding the concept way better, right? So, because there will be an interaction between urbanization probably and the 7th grade. Probably in the urban area there will be more 7th grader in the sample, and that probably leads to those kind of skewed observations that seemingly country students may actually do better with analogies. So it's kind of a bit misleading to some extent. I would have liked them to disambiguate that's clearer, or report perhaps either comment on those numbers or report less. Because that can really lead to misleading interpretations, right?
Yeah,
so just saying, okay,
that this small sample size basically skewed it, and there were urban 7th graders. And
exactly. So I'm with you on that one. I think it's most likely the aspect to be addressed. Also, any thoughts about the effect size? So they report main effect sizes of, let's say, 0.72 for the energy one, for the heat one, 0.3, 0.75 for the electricity. Anyway, so for the electricity is number 3 actually. So is there any comments you guys have? Or what needs to be read with care there? Well, every time they report correlations but what's in the parentheses? What do they report there? After the correlations, behind the correlations. Let's say for model 1, they report 0.72, and then there's in parentheses 0.34. What is that?
It's the post score, isn't it?
No, it's not. Yeah, that's misleading in the notation because you probably took it from the label on top, right?
Yeah.
Because no, it's not. It's actually the standard error. What's the standard error? Did you have?
90% of results are between minus 0.74. No, minus.
0.72. Yeah.
Are between. I can explain. Sorry.
You mean it's within 0.34 of the
Yeah.
0.74?
Exactly, precisely that, right? So, but that's precisely what it is, right? So, and the standard always says, okay, first of all, how far is it off, and also it has an implication on generalizability. So, given that sample in the average population, we assume an error of accuracy of 0.34, with respect to that effect size of 0.72, right? So, if you apply it, we are 0.72 better in energy understanding, right? So, but what do those standard errors tell you, the sizes? Does that spark confidence in the main effect value?
There's a very big error.
It's a kind of a massive error, right? So it's like you want to have that as small as possible, right? The smaller, the more likely is that the effect actually holds, right? So do the authors admit this in the paper? I'm checking whether you're at the paper. Do they admit it?
I can't really remember much talking about.
They referred that there is some uncertainty.
Yeah. So they're kind of honest-ish and say, actually there's a bit of a high standard error, so you need to read it with care. So they're really, really cautious in making distinct claims. But if you, for example, look at the case for electricity as opposed to the energy, the one that I've been referring to all the time, you see that the standard error is much, much smaller, right? 0.17. So that is, something that can be sounds quite a bit better, right, than having a 0.34 error that you probably need to anticipate. So anyway, so I don't want to necessarily dig too deep in the numbers because given the small sample size, that is just a massive overinterpretation that sits there. But what is important is that you treat it with care, right? So and sometimes people just have the numbers, put them in their favorite stats program, spit out the numbers, put them in tables, and not really sure what they actually do, right? So I'm not saying that that's true for the authors here, I'm just saying that sometimes happens. So again, it's still important to critically review, okay, does it actually make sense, and what conclusions can you draw on this one? What conclusions did they draw on this one? And how likely is it actually relevant? Because does it describe any sort of causation? Results? No, right? It's purely correlation, right? They just look, okay, I see a metric before assessment, metric after assessment, and then they correlate, okay, what did, administering the analogy in the area of energy make a difference in terms of learner performance? Whether this was actually the actual influence or something else, I don't know, the excitement with games, or the fact that they actually sat down at home and read up on it because they were so excited about it, is not reflected, right? So it could well be that there's a relationship there, a causal relationship, but it is actually really, that's a general problem with social science, that it's really, really tough to draw the link from correlation to causality, right? You need to be incredibly careful with this one. And so you need to be when reading this kind of work as well. So Marcus mentioned that they're actually quite doing a good job in reporting their limitations, right? Which I think I agree on as well, actually. In fact, even though they have the self-selection and small sample size, they admit all that, right? So from a paper point of view, this is actually a good paper. Because it does a good job in being very clear that, yeah, we did work, but it won't change the world because, right? So that's fine, and leaves themselves quite a bit of space for discussion. Any intuition as to why they do that? Why they're so explicit about limitations?
Maybe they know that people that read the paper will be looking for possible errors.
Number one, definitely, yep.
They kind of want the paper to be taken seriously.
That's a very good one. Yeah, exactly, right? So they are kind of seemingly honest scientists and saying, okay, well, we are very honest on what we do, what we don't do, but we have measured an effect. You guys go off and actually explore it more, right? Or fix it, or be better at it, right? But I think it can also be seen in the bigger light of, have you guys heard about the replication crisis? That was a thing that was going on in the cognitive sciences in the last 3-4 years. So basically, there was a study, a massive study, that took pretty much most of social psychology and cognitive psychology research and replicated it. So it just took all the papers, took all the reported information, right, and actually ran the experiments again. So a massive undertaking, massive effort, massive amount of money, and they realized, oh shit, in most cases, we can't reproduce anything. Right, so many cases of effects, there may be the effects there, meaning you do better with analogies than without, but the effect size, like 0.72 or something, were totally off, right? But massively off and hardly reproducible, and that challenged the entire field of psychology in a wider sense, but specifically social psychology, with respect to their research methods. The question is that should we dismiss this entire field pretty much now and start from scratch with better methods, better means of assessment, or how to deal with this, right? And after this replication crisis, people were really becoming super cautious in drawing conclusions with respect to effect size. So that's why they're saying, well, there's a difference because of analogies, but they actually don't explicitly mention the 0.72 again, the 0.35 or whatever else, all the stuff they actually reported as conclusive. They just said there could be something there. That's as far as they went. And even if you look at the research question is actually not for master thesis and so on. We often expect research questions to be slightly more complicated. This research question is not complicated, it's just long, right? So what does it suit? What does it basically say?
Is there something there?
Exactly. It just basically, that's a binary answer. Do students who play digital science games do better if they have the analogy thing as opposed to if they don't have it, right? Yes or no. That's what they want to answer. And yes, they kind of manage. We say for electricity, yes, right? So that's it, as far as they go. What we generally would want you to ask or explore, particularly in the technical field, we do it more, but also if you think about your masters, but in how far do students perform better when they, right? So please.
Yes, like the actual measurable in the research question is super iffy. It's like they say demonstrate greater understanding than the rest. Demonstrate greater understanding. That
also, yes.
Color.
How do you operationalize it, right? Yeah. So, and that comes back to Bloom's taxonomy. Sorry, we come back to this thing in a second. But this is also something. If you read the bigger picture, they pull up the abstraction quite high, right? They probably have their numbers and say, okay, how can we frame it? So we can report something that is actually true, right? But not misleading the reader potentially. And you see that here quite clearly, right? So the research question is actually really simple, right? So it's not a complex one. It's not. If you form your research question in your master's thesis, we would expect you to have richer conceptualizations, right? Whether you change them more time, it's a different story. But if you do your research project planning and so on, think about research question more differentiated. So they generally don't have Booleans as answers, but they have some sort of graduated metric, some continuous metric, or some qualitative insight in how far, for example, to what extent, right? So that would be an indication that you need information about effect size, which they simply don't have, right? So, so the paper is good in the sense that I don't think they misreport, but of course there's considerable limitations of all of you have figured out, right? So that's something to be. And yes, again, from the comments here, we have an active listener. They also downplay the significance, and that's right as well. They moderate this as well. So there's a lot of open avenues for further research they leave us. It's just that if people do that kind of fancy stats table, people always get scared of it and treat things like more, ascribe more truth than there is probably, right? So that's just for you to do some cautious reading if you look at this paper. Other than that, I agree. I mean, overall, they moderate most of their concerns quite well, so it's not too surprising. Cool. Beyond the paper, coming back to your talk a bit, few questions I have. Did you guys have questions, or do you have any more comments regarding the paper, or questions regarding the paper? Regarding the talk, Quest Atlantis.
Quest Atlantis, yes.
Is that thing still played?
They're kind of reworking it.
Right.
So new version, Quest Atlantis reworked, I think is the use called.
Right. Okay.
So seeing as it was so successful, they're trying to just because this was first run in 5 years and they have like 200,000 players. So they kind of want to try it again, but kind of updating it for the new problems. For example, they will probably implement climate change as one aspect now. If I would guess. Of course, kind of updating the graphics I would assume because it is 2000 graphics.
Yeah, of course. So I was looking at it. One of the around 2010 at least around that, until around that time frame at least. I mean, Second Life, right? So it's would have been a similar candidate, right? So because there's quite a bit of education opportunities there, right? So you can classroom participation, company formation, and as far as going playing instruments, I guess you could represent it somewhat. But I think that would have been a good addition as well to discuss what scenarios are represented in Second Life, because it at least was quite relevant for learning. And it was used in educational context. In fact, there was a lot of waves that people said, well, we have virtual classroom in Second Life, right? VR was not in at that time, or at least didn't have the performance. So they said, well, people can sit at home and join our classroom in Second Life. We all have fancy avatars and weird monsters in our heads and all that kind of stuff. But people thought that would improve education at that time. And that was quite heavily used. So that would be a good addition to your discussion as well, if perhaps, if thinking about your report in the end, perhaps to think about how that relates, because that came slightly after Quest Atlantis, so it would make for a good contrast to see, okay, what does the one do, what does the other one do, right? Of course, Second Life scope is way bigger anyway, right? So, but it's in a way a serious game, because it's meant to represent real life in a virtual environment, and that's as serious as it gets. But how far that's education, that's for you to narrow down then as part of it. Replication process is good. We have this one. Cool. Biases are discussed, that's cool. The other thing, Bloom's taxonomy, of course. So, every educator, if you are in that role, you will come across this thing, right? So, and there was a reason I didn't want to talk about this thing. But it has certain values. You guys all know Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Yeah. Right, so you have physiological needs, you have security needs, you have social needs, and then you have the developmental needs, right? Very crude thing from 1954, right? The assumption was fundamentally you need to satisfy the bottom to go to the next higher, right? So only by having food and shelter, you can actually go one step higher and actually care about the security in your social environment. Once that is done, you kind of have time to deal with social needs and actually interact with people and do stuff. And only if that is satisfied, you actually strive and become successful in further society. So the idea was, the aspiration of society should be to ensure that everyone's needs are satisfied so they can develop and bring about good in a society. So, Bloom's taxonomy is of course different, but similar in the same kind of approach, because it says, well, you need to do the first thing, to do the second thing, to do the third thing, to do the fourth thing. And there's been this is used for construction of courses explicitly, and actually I perhaps give you some pointers about how to code this, or decode it rather, as you will find. But it makes the kind of same assumption that you need to remember something first before you can understand it, and then apply it as a result of understanding it, and then being able to analyze it, and so on, and being more and more towards being from a consumer to a producer perspective, right? Where you actually evaluate and create as opposed to just understand, meaning absorb and remember. So the question is, there is very limited research in a way, even though this looks beautiful, to substantiate that this relationship actually holds in this very strict sense, right? What about me being better at applying something, doing something by, learning by doing, right? Without actually understanding the concept first, but actually retrospectively developing my understanding of the concept by actually doing something, right? So for example, learn how to drive a car, right? Even though no one told me, but I have a car and found it, and I'm pretty good at doing this, right? And only afterwards I actually understand the relationships and what actually happens under the hood. And I don't even know the terminology that's associated with this and so on, right? So you can actually, sometimes it's worthwhile if you have those schemata, especially if they're layered, to see if it actually holds. Do we have strictly this kind of approach of learning? this is a very knowledge-centered approach of learning. It doesn't really take into account skills. It assumes that only by understanding the concepts first, we can apply it later, and having a skills-based understanding of what we're doing, right? So using a car as an example, for example. So there's a bit of, while this not, there's nothing really wrong about it, interpreting at strict layers is something that's been challenged over time. Yet, and here it comes, our courses are mostly built around this principle. So if you see, for example, in the first year course descriptor, right, for the first year, you find terms like as recall, describe, right, and things like this, right? So, and they actually reflect, they're directly linked, the terminology is linked to idea of remembering. It's just about recall. Can you reproduce what we taught you in class? Basically, do you sit here and listen to Glenn and can say exactly the same in the exam, right? So that would be recall, and this would be assessed on the first level. Understanding would be something like interpret, right? So you get an analogy as an example, you get an analogy, and you need to explain something else using that particular analogy. That would substantiate understanding, right? So applying would be something like design, right? So if you're designing an application and something like this, it means you use known design patterns that you learn based on understanding and applying to a new problem, right? In mobile, we teach you, well, no, mobile is not a good example. If you get an example application and you need to do the same thing for something else, showing transfer knowledge, that's application, for example. Analysis, and now we're getting closer to master level, is going beyond this. Now we're looking at something that's out there and actually analyzing it anymore. We're not building, right? So the bottom one usually is associated with construction, the top one's more with evaluation analysis. And critical systematic approaches. So, for example, in master's papers, you would more looking at analyzing things, evaluating, or driving creation and so on. So, this is basically how scaffolding in modern education is still kind of done. So, if you read this carefully, but here we come back to learner styles. It may just not work like this for everyone, right? So, this is kind of the mainstream kind of conception. And sometimes it's worthwhile to be critical, and Simon's always good about this, being very critical about this systematic approach, because sometimes people in the first year may actually learn much better actually doing something, and then in the second year actually learn what they actually did. Kind of, you know what I mean? So kind of the wrong way around seemingly, but moving away from this constructionist idea, right? So reflect is another nice one, analyzing, for example, right? So so in the third year, especially in the bachelor's, the ones that did it here, that reflection is a big deal. Right, it's every time what you learn about yourself and all that kind of stuff, and it's clearly moving up the higher end, where it's really about developing understanding by knowing yourself and how you systematically apply new concepts to or known concepts to other areas, right? So whereas masters moves clearly beyond this. Anyway, just a few words on this one. Anyway,
so. The main reason why I actually wanted to discuss this is because of when I kind of researched science education games. They were all kind of using this pyramid as the main way of learning.
Yeah.
And they were all kind of stuck on the first level, which is why I kind of wanted to bring it up, because they're kind of failing to teach.
Yeah.
Properly the concepts instead of
yeah, I agree with you. I mean, that's it's really worthwhile to know in a way. But thank you for bringing it up in the first place. Because if you're in an education environment, you will come across this piece. There's absolutely no way you get around it. And there's some good ideas in there. I'm not saying it's inherently wrong. It's just, again, it's a very crude understanding of the world, right? So it's in a sense that, we all work this way. And it's just like, it won't necessarily be that case, right? So, but for example, under skills for this very course, I'm reading them to you. Able to generate high quality questions, for example, that would be analysis or evaluation in this area, able to inquire, able to analyze, able to critically review, right? So it's all in the top three, I think not the creating ones really, but the evaluation and analyzing perspective. So all the terms are actually gathered around this. So if you reread all your courses you're taking, you can actually figure out where you're supposed to sit in that hierarchy anyway. But you're right, there's no discussion about it. Any ideas about how that could be improved?
How it could be improved?
Yeah, did you find evidence of approaches that would allow to move up the layers, I guess?
Yeah, so, well, the main evidence is kind of the paper itself, which I can discuss, because it's trying to move up to the understanding level. But apart from that, it was kind of difficult, because one of the things missing in this field specifically is survey papers. So I had a lot of troubles finding relevant articles and research papers for this. But most of those I found did not look at like how do they make them understand it, just how do they remember things.
Right.
So I could not really find much about moving them up.
So did they make explicit reference to the hierarchy every time, or did you draw the link by seeing, oh, they talk about recall and remembering, therefore it must be first level of Bloom's taxonomy? Or did they actually explicitly link to Bloom's taxonomy and said we're operating on that level?
One of the surveys I found specifically linked to Bloom's taxonomy, which was how I found it.
Right, okay.
But the papers themselves never actually referenced it.
Okay. So there's also this thing that there may be very crude understanding of education behind the paper, right? In the sense that similarly, does it improve anything effectively, right? So then the easy catch is to go into remembering. Multiple choice is a good indicator for that level of assessment, right? So that you actually don't have an application, and there's no way you can at best assess understanding with multiple choice, but even applying it is already really, really hard. You need to be really good at writing multiple choice questions to do that. But it supports what you say, that most of them are actually allocated there. Any ideas how to improve it? Outside of the scientific realm, just you as a educated game designer or developer.
One of the major things they need to do is like stop treating a game as the single activity for how to learn. They need to kind of incorporate it into the learning mechanism, I guess.
Yep.
So instead of like play this game and tell us what you know, you should play this game and kind of ask them how did you understand it, what did you learn, how can you apply it further, and kind of use it as a basis of discussion instead of like the sole means of learning. This is what I think, at least. Because if you go back to Quest Atlantis, one of the things they did, they created a social world where people had to cooperate to actually solve problems and learn, which kind of avoided the Bloom's taxonomy pyramid trap, because you did not expect, you did not force people to just learn one thing. They had to understand how to use it so they could cooperate with others and apply it to the quest they were working on together. Also, they had teachers was also playing this game and helping everyone, which further kind of helped them understand.
Right.
Yeah, so the example I have is 2 coding games for the phone, where the first coding game you were presented with the different logical operators, so that's you get slides and you read them, and after that you get a test, so kind of check out the remember part after the first slide, and instead of you writing a piece of code, you have to fill in the right keywords in a snippet. That's kind of, they skip the understanding part and jump straight to the applying. The second coding game, you also get presented with the logical operators, but at the part where you apply it, you always have the operators in front of you. So they skip the remembering part, kind of. You just have, you can click buttons and they will insert the keyword for you, but you create the whole snippet. So there you get better understanding and applying. So I mean, in terms of game, I think they have a lot of option in shuffling the whole taxonomy thingy. But the second game I got more out of, because I didn't have to remember the keywords, but I had to understand the logic and how they work. So I think games are more suitable for jumping outside of the Bloom taxonomy thing, because they have a kind of unique position where they are very applicable to applying what you're trying to learn.
Interesting enough, I found serious games kind of do a good job more normally to understand, but specifically for the field of scientific education, they're kind of struggling behind the rest of the games. Except for mathematics, because that's quite heavy research. I did not take mathematics into consideration because that's kind of, it was on a whole different level compared to every other scientific science study.
Yeah. Cool. Well, it's an interesting insight into the world of serious gains in education. Yeah, I mean, there's so many avenues to go down, right? So you kind of can open up quite a lot of cans of worms and drift down there. But I think that specifically the paper, I think it's kind of really spot on that you pick something that is actually applied in a class environment and has the gamification component. So I found that it's a very good choice with and despite all the challenges in the application, but also it's actually quite good paper. So so that was a good aspect there. Any other questions that you guys have potentially? Comments? Cool. I think. Yeah, I was thinking. That's more like a general question. What do you think is the risk of using analogies for teaching? Is there any risk? They didn't really discuss that.
Well, you kind of have to first of all create the analogy, which does require some effort.
Yeah.
And then you kind of risk that it's not being easily understood at all. You may just create an analogy that makes sense in your head, but doesn't really make sense for anybody else.
Yeah.
Especially if you're like on a different level in education-wise, you may not understand what kind of analogy works for people in 6th grade, 7th grade.
Yeah.
Which.
Yeah, so I agree with this, the pitching the level, of course. But when reading the paper, there was this thing about students being confused when they have a knot in that thing that the power would no longer flow, right? The power would no longer flow in the wire. So, and I think this is where the analogy to some extent can be challenged, right? So it can be a problematic thing. So your analogy may well explain certain characteristics you want to convey, like positive, negative, polarization and so on. But when people suddenly go beyond this, and as you say, we pitch it wrong, and they have too advanced questions about resistance, the analogy is not able to explain that anymore, right? Or the analogy makes you misleading and it makes you draw wrong conclusions, right? So it actually doesn't correspond, sufficiently aligned with the subject of study. That's the risk there, basically, right? So analogies shouldn't be taken too literal. That's the usual challenge. And I think that's part of the argument why they want to have the distal analogy concept, right? That's your idea.
They also kind of layer the whole problem. So if you have one student who doesn't understand the analogy in the first place, and then you go on trying to explain the analogy mapping with the curriculum they're teaching, you can add another layer of confusion where students will get hung up on the analogy itself and kind of distant from the real world situation. So you get these multiple layers of confusion.
That's true. Yeah, so that's one thing that could have done, explored a bit more there as well. I mean, they drew an interesting, they made some pointers with respect how to construct good analogies. There was basically thinking about relationships, structures, and processes, right? So that's the three kind of mechanisms that you could look at and say, are they similar, right? Either one of those, and use those to construct analogies, which is actually quite nice. I mean, giving a constructive pointer of how you could come about. But I would like to have seen that more in the paper, that actually say, okay, how do we construct the analogy 1, 2, 3, 4, right? And which of those aspects did you pronounce or use or emphasize, right? Or was it more like, do you want to focus on the process, the structure, or whatever else, right? So, and I think that would really make for a richer conception in terms of giving a recommendations with respect to the design of those concepts, meaning making it easier for me to, similar to your concept, basically apply something in my classroom and then hopefully have similar results, as opposed to just seeing, okay, someone did something and it has positive outcomes, but they leave me alone with any, they don't give me complete prescription of how I could possibly do it if I'm an educator, right? So that's something to be discussed. So analogies is usually a bit dangerous, right? If you talk about science, we're kind of really careful with analogies, because you want to have model representation that is sufficiently comprehensive, and energies often are not simply. But I think for that purpose, that may just do to get your foot in the door of some understanding of physical concepts, I guess. Yeah, Marcus.
The one thing which I really didn't like about the paper, and it has been mentioned earlier, is that they only focused on the electricity game and the electricity analogy, which they had some data supporting that it actually worked. But I think they should expand the paper explaining each of the analogies and each of the games, such that it could be easier for us as readers to perhaps make up our mind on why some of the analogies failed or why some of the games were bad.
That's my biggest problem with this paper is they kind of skipped over the things that didn't work.
So like even though they admit that if perhaps some of the games were bad or perhaps some of the analogies weren't right, they should have expressed it in the paper because it's still interesting.
Yeah. I agree. I mean, sometimes it's even better to get bad examples than the good ones, right? Because you will at least avoid pitfalls that they obviously have trapped into and that they're probably more commonly found than randomly getting it right.
Yeah, and if somebody were to research this, they don't know the pitfalls they went into. So like their starting point, they have to start on the bottom pretty much, because they don't explain or shine light on some of the potential pitfalls they went into.
That would indeed make up for a good follow-up paper of those guys themselves, right? Saying, okay, how do you design it and what are the issues, right? But usually those papers are harder to sell, so to the reviewers, right? Because they don't provide necessarily the scientific merit per se, but they are good documentation value in a way. So, cool. Right, I think we leave it at that, right? So let's thank the speaker and the moderator for this session. Yeah, thanks for the insight. So I hope you have some feedback for your report. Things you can discuss about.
There's a lot.
Yes.
Quite useful.
And we go from there. Cool. Well, next week decision making. Right. So we need to agree on a paper, or
I have looked at some papers.
just stop the screen. Yeah.
I still